Hello, Frogg Moody here from Salisbury History Festival. Today I'd like to talk to you about the early history of Fisherton House Asylum, later to be known as the Old Manor Hospital, and to also give you some information about my time there as head gardener. So let's start at the beginning. 1829, Fisherton House belonged to Charles Finch. It became a very large institution between 1856 and 1880, with large numbers of pauper patients and also criminal lunatics. This was under the Home Office licence. In fact, it was the only Wiltshire house in 1829 to provide any occupation for patients, because several of the pauper patients were employed in gardening. In 1862, Fisherton House contained 245 criminal lunatics, 75 paupers, and around 84 private patients. Some of the criminal patients left on the opening of Broadmoor. But let's go back even earlier to our next picture here, which is Laverstock House, which was set in 12 acres of land. Even before moving to Fisherton House, members of the Finch family had purchased this Laverstock house here in 1779. This was first described as a madhouse and later as a lunatic asylum. Even earlier, believe it or not, the Finch family had two madhouses in London, very fashionable ones in Chelsea and Kensington. There was allegedly another madhouse in Wiltshire, but I've yet to discover where that was. So this next picture is the Fisherton House admission book. This is a typical page. This would chart obviously a picture of each patient, their symptoms, any treatments that were administered, and general remarks from the doctors at the Fisherton House Asylum. Talking of the treatments, let's just have a look at a few of the treatments from those times. First, we have what they called the cupping therapy. This was an ancient form of alternative medicine on which a therapist put special cups on your skin for a few minutes to create like a suction. This was used to help pain, inflammation, blood flow, relaxation, and well-being, as well as a deep type of tissue massage. Perhaps a little bit more well known was bloodletting. This was the withdrawal of blood from a patient to prevent or cure illness and disease. It is conceivable, really, historically, that in the absence of other treatments for hypertension, bloodletting sometimes had the beneficial effect of temporarily reducing blood pressure by reducing blood volume. Purging was used for ailments of the stomach. Emetics were administered, thus cleansing the body and restoring well-being. Vomits, they were given once a week. Leg locks and straitjackets were used, and gradually they went out by around about 1847. For mania, tartar emetic was said to act briskly, as did opium, arsenic, and believe it or not, creosote. And wine was added to make the medicine more tasty. To procure rest, the hop pillow was widely recommended, and it's strange to think that you can actually get hop pillows to this day on eBay. Warm baths were recommended, and they were still in use when the state took over the Old Manor Hospital in 1954. Patients were immersed in warm water with boards over the top of the bath with a hole left for the head to emerge. And when the Old Manor Hospital was closing down, I actually managed to get on some of the wards and see these baths for myself. Even though there were treatments, obviously, at Fisherton House, there were still attacks, and this next picture depicts one such attack that I found completely by accident in the local Salisbury Journal newspaper. This was a chap called William McCabe, a patient, and we're going back to 1873. McCabe had been incarcerated in Fisherton House Asylum for around about 20 years. But even before that, he'd been incarcerated in Bedford Asylum for 12 years. His only crime, as far as I've managed to find out, was that he threw a stone through a window. But once he actually was put into Fisherton House Asylum, he maintained that he had visions of an ex-girlfriend, Mary Taylor, and that was the only reason really he was being kept in Fisherton House. He'd made numerous requests to be transferred to another asylum, all to no avail. Now, the Lunacy Commission was sent round to each mental institute in this country to see if the patients were being well looked after, the food was okay, the accommodation was okay, and they had the power to close any institution down if it wasn't up to scratch. On this particular occasion in 1873, two people, Dr. Wilkes and Mr. Lutwidge, were doing an inspection on behalf of the Lunacy Commission when McCabe, by this time he'd reached boiling point. He pretended to be asleep. He'd found a rusty nail in the garden that day, and as the commission walked through the ward doing their inspection, McCabe jumped up and from behind he forced the rusty nail into the temple of Mr. Lutwidge, rendering him semi-conscious. He was taken to the study of the Finch family and then later transferred to the White Hart Hotel, where it was more palatial surroundings. Now, Mr. Lutwidge was the favourite uncle of Lewis Carroll, and Lewis Carroll was telegrammed. He came to Salisbury instantly to be by his favourite uncle's bedside, and Lutwidge did rally a little, but unfortunately, as soon as Lewis Carroll went back to London, 2 days later, Dr. Lutwidge died. There is one other thing. There was another famous attack, but I'll come on to that later. As the years went on, more and more buildings were purchased and patients were encouraged to take part in things like farming and gardening. You see, doctors believed that nature had a great healing power, and great gardens were developed, as our aerial picture here shows. Now, you can see the bottom right-hand corner is now gone right down to the railway line. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see all the trees. This was the old Manor Hospital orchard. The far top left picture, this was really opened up to farming, vegetables, that sort of thing were grown there. So the old Manor Hospital, as it became a lot more self-sufficient. Everything was in-house, including cattle, pigs, that sort of thing. And also the Fisherton House Asylum purchased lands outside of this aerial picture, different locations, and we'll come on to some of those later as well. As we went into the Edwardian era, Cecil Chubb, who's in our picture here, became the proprietor of the asylum. In 1902, he'd married Mary Finch, whose uncle was Dr. Corbin Finch, so he actually married into the Finch family. Cecil Chubb was the famous man who bought Stonehenge. It was on September the 21st, 1915, that he walked into a property sale in the new theatre, Castle Street, and came out £6,600 the poorer, and the owner of Stonehenge. Legend has it that his wife said to him, could you go to the auction? We need some new chairs. And he went down there. You can imagine when he got home and his wife said, did you get the chairs? And he shouted back, no, I was outbid, but I did manage to get Stonehenge. This picture here is Benton Lodge. Cecil Chubb, after he gave Stonehenge to the nation, became Sir Cecil Chubb. This is where he lived. This is where Bertie, the future King George VI, was a regular guest. Bertie, as he was known, liked the estate because it was small, secluded, and away from London. It was horribly demolished in the early 70s, in the area that became the Wilton Road police station. If you look at the picture, you can see the fountain. This was the fountain that was eventually taken down to the old Manor Hospital, a little bit further down Wilton Road. It was taken down there on a hand cart by two gardeners. At Fisherton House, Cecil Chubb realised the benefit of plants and highlighted the beautiful grounds and gardens in a brochure one of several detailed publicity brochures produced which form a very useful basis when you analyse the estate and its regime. So what I'm going to do is go through this brochure. I think it's worth it because here you'll be seeing some imagery that not many people have seen, and I think this is out of print. So this slide here shows the approach to Fisherton House. So this next image here, this is Fisherton House. You can see right in the middle of the picture you've got the raised flower border. This would eventually become the Old Manor Fountain, that is still there, I think, outside of the Old Manor Hospital. Boarded up now, but it will eventually make the centrepiece of the new redevelopment. So if we can just go back to the brochure that I mentioned, I'll read a few passages now. The institution was established for the cure and treatment of ladies and gentlemen mentally afflicted. It is pleasantly situated in a most convenient part of the city of Salisbury, and being on a high level, secures perfect drainage. It also is near the main road from Salisbury to Exeter, and though within a very short distance from the cathedral and railway station, has surroundings of remarkably picturesque and rural character. If we look at this next image, the building at the top of the picture, this was one of the gentlemen's wards. Where the path meanders around, the other side of the path, large piece of grass there would become the Fisherton Institution tennis court. Back to the brochure. The institution is divided into a number of detached block buildings, which ensure ample airspace, the whole being distributed over nearly 20 acres. Now, this next image shows one of the ladies' wards. You can just about see it to the left-hand side of the picture. And what I really like about this picture is you can start to see now the wonderful grounds and gardens. This image shows us a view of the dairy farm. The dairy and home farms had the additional area of 300 acres and are held in connection with the institution and provide a large proportion of the food supply. This area here, I have a feeling that this is actually the other side of the town path looking towards Arnhem. I don't know that for sure, but it certainly looks like it. And here's another view of the dairy farm. In this picture, you can see that Fisherton House also kept horses and farming implements. You can just about see Salisbury Cathedral in the background of this picture. So this is another large area of farming land that the Fisherton House acquired. The division of the asylum into separate blocks had the advantage of rendering more easily the proper classification of patients and also ensured greater safety in case of fire. Outdoor exercise is greatly encouraged, and within the asylum are spacious cricket, tennis and croquet grounds. So here is an image of the cricket ground, and we've also pointed out that there are extensive tennis courts as well. The brochure tells us that the surrounding of the city of Salisbury are most beautiful, thus offering exceptional advantages for carriages and motor drives, and such places of interest as Stonehenge, Old Sarum and Wardle Castle are within easy access. Yeah, our brochure refers to this next image as the Recreation Hall. To me, it's the Old Manor Ballroom, and to many others, it always will be the Old Manor Ballroom. In fact, it was known as after the visitation of Edward VII, it was known as the Royal Ballroom because he had actually attended a function here. But the brochure tells us that the large recreation hall is not only used for various special entertainments, which are frequently provided, but also used for a weekly ball, which is greatly appreciated and much looked forward to by both patients and staff alike, music being supplied by a string band. This is a really good sized billiard room, and this would have been mainly enjoyed by the gentlemen patients at Fisherton House. Here's a lovely shot of the interior of the Fisherton House chapel. It's still there as far as I'm aware. Well, in fact, actually not aware, I know it's still there. When I worked there, they had a huge great tarpaulin over the roof and it's still there, so I hope no internal damage has been done. Sunday and weekday services were arranged by the Bishop of Salisbury, actually, who was chaplain of the institution. This is another one of the gardens at Fisherton House. This was the other side of the Wilton Road. You can see the building to the right hand side. This was Montague House, the back of Montague House. In 1921, I mentioned the attacks. There were two famous attacks, really. This is the second one. In 1921, Dr. Samuel Edgar Martin was appointed medical superintendent. During this time, many improvements were made at Fisherton Asylum, and he stayed there till around about 1952. He had a great collection of antiques and a considerable knowledge of plants, and he instructed the gardeners to plant rare shrubs and plants in consequence of the grounds and greenhouses. These were a constant source of admiration. In fact, they used to send samples of the produce from this establishment on exhibition to London. It was during one of his ward rounds that Dr. Martin was attacked by a patient who stabbed him in the head with a penknife. Luckily, Dr. Martin survived this attack, but the patient who attacked him at one time had been a solicitor on the famous Dr. Crippen case. In the last image, I mentioned the back of Montague House. Well, this image shows the front of Montague House, right on the Wilton Road. The top picture is an image that I found in the newspaper, and this shows from the 1880s when it was Miss Jarman's School for Young Ladies. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit now about my time there as gardener and eventually head gardener at the Old Manor Hospital. I actually lived in this building because when I got the job, I had nowhere to live really, and the head gardener said, well, you can move into the nurses' home, which was here, Montague House. It was my father who told me that there was a position at the Old Manor Hospital in the garden section, and I went up there to meet the head gardener at the time, Ken Toogood, who said, when can you start? And I said, well, Monday. This was only on the Wednesday, and I said, so when do I come up for the interview? And he said, well, you've just had it, start Monday. We're now looking at the inside of the Old Manor Hospital greenhouse, where we grew up towards 60,000 plants, mainly for the summer show. You see, we decked out not just the Old Manor Hospital, but Odstock, Fordingbridge, Amesbury, Wilton, and numerous hospitals, because it was believed, particularly at the Old Manor Hospital, that the colour of plants was very beneficial to the patients. Talking of the patients, when I first started there, I knew absolutely nothing about mental health, nothing at all whatsoever. The first few weeks I was getting used to the machinery, looking around the greenhouses, etc. It was only later on when I went across and used to go to the wards, because to cut the grass behind each ward, you had to go through the ward because each garden was fenced in. The greenhouse that I've just shown you was around about 100 foot long by 60 foot wide. But as well as that greenhouse, we had other greenhouses all around the Old Manor site, including this one here, wooden construction greenhouse. And it was here that I went on my first week starting as the gardener at the Old Manor Hospital that Ken Toogood said, put these on. And it was 2 white gloves and a white apron with a big pocket on the front. And I thought I was auditioning for the Freemasons, but he said, come with me. He then took me down to the orchard, set up a ladder, and I had to twist these apples with the white gloves on as not to bruise them. They were put 9 to a box in straw, and then we put them into the Old Manor Hospital sheds. Now the reason for this was we're all expected to come to work on Christmas Day, where we went round the wards and distributed these apples amongst the patients. So this image here shows other greenhouses. These were actually behind, they're all broken down and destroyed. They were behind Llangarren House, which was another nurse's home. Originally, Llangarren was called Claylands because it was here that they made the clay, or got the clay, for the Fisherton white bricks. The reason I pointed this picture out is that there was wonderful blackberry bushes here, all around here. And my dad, actually, years before I had this job at the old manor, had taken me up there to pick blackberries because I was keen on making homemade wine. And these really were big blackberries. And I made about 6 gallons of blackberry wine. I should add that I fortified it with bottles of vodka as well. And when I moved into the nurse's home, I was the darling of the nurse's home because it was all females really, apart from 3 males. And of course, I had all these bottles of homemade wine. And I have great pleasure in telling you that I managed to get 13 psychiatric nurses blind drunk one evening, so drunk that they couldn't report for work the next day. It nearly backfired on me because I was carpeted and I very nearly lost my accommodation and my job, but they decided to give me a second chance. So as the months went by, I knew that the head gardener, who was already in his late 60s, he wasn't going to be there for much longer. And already the situation in horticultural was one of anything that you did, be it using a chainsaw or weed killing, required you to go to Lackham College to get a certificate for doing it. I seemed to be the only person who was putting in for these courses. By this time, I'd actually said to Ken Toogood, look, grass cutting's all well and good, but I want to learn more about proper gardening, propagation, that sort of thing. And he agreed and said, okay, how about if once a week you go to the conservatory, which you can see in the picture here. You've got Finch House, but to the left-hand corner, you've got the lean-to conservatory. You go down, that'll be your domain once a week, and it's there that you can grow plants from seed, you can take cuttings, that sort of thing. And we'll also give you weekend watering duties that you'll get paid for. So, on a Saturday morning and Saturday evening and a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening, you do all the watering. So that was it. So he would come down and teach me techniques, but that was my domain. And this is the interior of that conservatory that I've just mentioned, with a vast array of plants and a really good looking gardener in the middle of the picture who just happens to be me. This picture was actually taken because while I was doing all this work, I used to have the radio blaring out, and for some reason a reporter from the Salisbury Journal came in one day and said, what's going on here? I can hear this music blasting out. And I said, well, the music is beneficial to the plants, a bit like Prince Charles. He said, oh, this is fantastic. We'll do an article for the local paper on this. So a good friend of mine, Roger Elliott, the local Salisbury Journal photographer, came down, took the picture, and it made a very nice little article. And it didn't do me any harm as well, because my ambition was to become the head gardener. So I was starting to get a little bit of publicity. The most important place, I suppose, really, is it's always the entrance to the main building. That had to be kept in prestige condition. It had the fountain, as you can see in the picture. It had the fountain there as a centerpiece, and the actual building behind it, Finch House, it was an amazing building. So when I took over the conservatory, I was told that I had to maintain the fountain. I had to landscape all around the fountain. That was to become my domain. One of the other things I had to do, which I knew absolutely nothing about at all, was the fact that the psychiatric nurses every New Year's Eve would jump into this fountain, with their wine and their champagne, and they'd also put their underwear all over the fountain. And just after New Year's Eve, of course, the next day, it would be my job to put a scaffold plank across the fountain here and walk precariously across to take all this underwear off. There was one occasion where I did this, and I'd had a drink the night before myself, and I slipped off the scaffold plank and went into the fountain water, which I can assure you was extremely deep, loads of fish in there as well, freezing cold, and it's a wonder I didn't drown. So here is the fabulous Old Manor Hospital fountain in all its glory. Um, the picture on the left-hand side shows me on the right and a chap called Chris White on the left. Um, by this time, I'd actually become the head gardener, and I employed Chris to help me get this fabulous fountain running again. The fountain itself, when it had been taken down from Benton Lodge that I mentioned earlier, was literally plonked on top of a concrete plinth. So what we did was we got an angle grinder and we cut a hole in the concrete plinth, and all the copper piping was corroded. So we substituted that for plastic piping and got this wonderful fountain up and running. And it looked so spectacular because it was never turned off. And in the winter, if it was cold enough, you used to get all icicles hanging off. And one famous morning, there was about 13 photographers on Wilton Road with their cameras on tripods taking pictures of the spectacle. So when we managed to restore the fountain, it made the front page of the Health News Weekly, which was the hospital's in-house journal. Mallory Hanmore, who was the editor of this newsletter, said to me, "Can you write up the article?" Which I'd never written an article before my whole life. And I said, "Well, okay, I'll have a go." And as I say, it was on the front page. And then she contacted me to say, "People love this article. Why don't you do an article called Gardening Matters once a week?" Which was a little bit of a sort of challenge for me because, as I say, I wasn't used to writing, but I can chart this. And I did this Gardening Matters article probably for years, probably 5 or 6 years, every week. And I can chart this as being where I first got into writing and research, because each article had to be researched. I'd been head gardener for about a year and I was really thinking about the job and what I'd want to bring to it myself. So I decided that maybe we should go full circle and bring patients back into the grounds and introduce some form of horticultural therapy, which I didn't really know anything about, but I just had in the back of my mind that it would be a good idea. There were large areas of the Old Manor Hospital that weren't being used that were obvious could be wildflower meadows. So the first thing I did was invite the schools down to plant up things like buddleia and get involved. And it's surprising because, again, the newspapers caught hold of this, and it made the newspapers, as you can see by this next image. This proved to be, this idea of horticultural therapy, actually, it started to click. And although they had an industrial therapy unit at the Old Manor Hospital where patients wrapped up hose pipes and plastic, that sort of thing, many of them felt that they'd be better suited themselves to outdoor work, and were walking down to the greenhouse to ask me if they could be, part of the regime happening there. 2 or 3 to start with, and then I started getting referrals from the wards at the Old Manor Hospital. And I said, "Look, this is all well and good, but I've had absolutely no training whatsoever in horticultural therapy." To which they replied, "Okay, well, we'll pay for you to go and get it," which they did. And I went to Reading and got all my certification in horticultural therapy. So the horticultural therapy idea was starting to get really good, and we were into double figures of referrals. What I didn't realise was that care in the community was being mooted, and my 100-foot long greenhouse was one of the areas to be sold off. I didn't know anything about this at all, and it was rather devastating for me when I was called in the office to say this has got to stop, horticultural therapy patients. It was down to me to tell these people that it was going to end, and tears were shed. Tears were shed for me as well when I saw my wonderful greenhouse pulled down and destroyed. But this was the instigation of care in the community. And our next image here actually is not a greenhouse, but if you were to look towards the Old Manor fountain from the Wilton Road, you'd be looking at this structure, which from the outside does look like a greenhouse. It's not. If you were to walk down this slope, you'd come to a sharp turning to the left and then a sharp turning to the right, and you'd be into one of the famous Old Manor Hospital tunnels. There are supposed to be numerous tunnels under the Old Manor Hospital site. In my capacity as head gardener, I had a master key that took me in every single door in that complex, and I explored most of them. I only ever came across one tunnel. Here it is, and the reason for this tunnel was to take these hot water pipes. They heated up the offices and the wards throughout the hospital. Originally, so I was told by an old gardener, when I was inquisitive, said, well, the original idea for the tunnel was that on Sunday, when the male patients and female patients went to the little chapel we looked at already, it was taboo for them to walk together, be seen together, and so the lady patients would walk through the wonderful grounds whilst the male patients would walk through the tunnel. The end of the old manor was close, and as you can see by this picture, windows start to become boarded up. You can also see that my lovely conservatory, Victorian conservatory, is now gone. It was demolished. Most of the buildings by this time around the Old Manor Hospital site were boarded up. Even though the buildings were being boarded up, or the windows, we still had to maintain the grounds, and this is a picture of the interior of the Old Manor Ballroom, which outside of it had a wonderful rose garden, where I was one day pruning the roses when I heard this hissing sound, continuous hissing sound, and with my master key I went into the front door and was horrified to find that the pipe, hot water pipe that I've just shown you in the tunnel, had burst. Hot water and steam had escaped, and the wonderful Old Manor Ballroom sprung floor was standing up like bananas. All the floorboards were like bananas. The whole place was dripping with water, including the wonderful, absolutely gorgeous mirrors that adorned this lovely hall. The mirrors are actually falling to bits. This is Orchard House. This was really a house that was for old ladies, some of which were in their 80s when I was there. But when it was closed down and all the windows were boarded up, just before that happening, probably a week before it was boarded up, I was still cutting the grass, believe it or not. And one of the nurses came out and said, look, one of the old ladies has lost a very expensive ring. We don't know where it is. As you're cutting the grass, can you keep a lookout for it? I did. I didn't find it. But then I remembered that when I had my horticultural therapy group, one of my friends, I made very good friends in this group, one in particular called Mike. Unfortunately, he died, and I helped his father clear his flat. And his father said, look, you can have anything in the flat to remember Mike by. And I said, well, okay, actually, over there, I can remember Mike buying this metal detector from a car boot sale, probably just a week before he died. I said that would be very nice to have that, and you know, to remember Mike by. It's yours. So I took it and I tried it out. It worked perfectly. Then I remembered the ring, so I rushed over to this area and I went all over this lawn looking for this ring. I'd go a few steps, the metal detector would go off, I'd dig a hole. And to cut a long story short, there was probably about 70 holes dug all over this lawn before I realised that in my haste to start this project, I hadn't taken off my steel toe cap boots, which made the metal detector go off, and I found an absolute fool looking back on this lawn and seeing it completely dug up. So the Old Manor Hospital closed down. I was redeployed to Odstock, and one of the areas that I've already mentioned, of which was Langarren House, shown here in our picture, was due to be sold off, and it was my job to come down. They couldn't actually sell it because around the back of this house had the dreaded Japanese knotweed, and which is a very evasive plant. You can't sell any property with this stuff growing. So my job was to come down every Friday afternoon to try and eradicate this awful weed. which I must say is it's not just evasive, it's dangerous. It pushes up concrete. To me, it was a bit of a jolly because it meant that I was due to finish quite early on a Friday anyway, and I would come down here and just it was a bit of a jolly. But there was one occasion, it's probably the week before I was due to finish because I'd managed to wipe out this Japanese knotweed. The week before I was due to finish, I thought I could smell burning, something burning, but I didn't take much notice and I finished my job, washed myself off and went home. The following weekend, I had a phone call and this is what happened. Somebody had crept in to the house that itself was boarded up and set fire to it. I don't know how they got in because it was completely fenced off with razor wire, etc. There's no way it could have set fire to itself, but you can see the absolute destruction it did. And I had a word with one of the firemen to say, look, can I take a quick picture of the inside? That was highly dangerous because the roof was falling in and all sorts. But he let me, and it's remarkable that the nursing home that stands there at the moment is just looks absolutely fantastic. And you wouldn't think, looking at the shell of this place, that they could have ever done it up to such a manner as it is today. So the old Manor Hospital site stood empty and boarded up for quite a few years, and to be perfectly frank with you, it was nothing short of an eyesore. People referred to it as an absolute disgrace. By this time, care in the community was up and running. Did it work to start with? I don't think so at all. That's a whole new subject we could go into. But then things changed and Platinum Skies Development bought the site to do it up for an over 50s development. They had all their presentations at the White Hart Hotel that I went down to, spoke to the people, told them my association with the site. They were very interested, spoke to me on numerous occasions about what they were doing there, and showed me all the plans that I looked at and said, well, if you actually build what you're showing in these plans, it's going to look fantastic. So just to finish, let's have a look at the plans that they showed me. So here are the plans that were shown to me by the Platinum Skies Development. And I remember saying to them, this is a pretty good sales pitch, but will it actually look like this? And they assured me that it would, which of course I was delighted. I have to say that they kind of have stayed true to their word. I think the actual development site, and I've spoken to a lot of the people that are living there at the moment, and I've also given part of this presentation to them on this actual site, and they're delighted with their accommodation. So that is great to hear. The fly in the ointment, as far as I'm concerned, is the Finch House itself. That if you drive down Milton Road, you can see the facade of the old Finch House precariously perched up by metal girders. It looks like it could fall down any minute, and I've been in contact with Platinum Skies to say, look, what are you doing about this? And their plan is to build on the back of it, is to do the fountain up and have that again as a centerpiece. But they're having one or two structural problems. To me, will they ever actually build onto it? It seems doubtful for me, but let's hope that they actually do pull off what they say they're going to do. In conclusion, I would just like to say that even though mental health is such a taboo subject, and even growing up, I can remember it called the local loony bin, etc. As far as I'm concerned, it was the most enjoyable job that I've ever had. I absolutely loved my time there. The more I got into meeting the patients, because you were allowed to, you were actually encouraged that if you were sat down on the bench having your lunch and a patient sat next to you, you were encouraged to talk to them, give them the time of day. It was a fantastic job, and the care in the community thing broke my heart in a way, because you saw everybody, all these people that I'd seen in a wonderful environment are now on the steps of the library, and etc. etc. We could go into this in more detail, but I'm not going to. Just finish by saying that I just loved every minute of my working day at the Old Manor Hospital.